Hey y'all. So the new banned and suspended announcement dropped today, and there have been a lot of changes. So let's get right into it and talk about how much these affected heroes are affected and what can we expect moving forward in the competitive scene after these ProQuests. First, we have Winter's Wail. Winter's Wail has been banned in Classic Constructed, and in the explanation that they provided for why they chose to ban this card, I really like that they brought up the fact that Winter's Wail allows you to play with a shield as well, and the reference they made to other two-handed weapons. So, for example, let's talk about Sledge of Anvilheim for a bit. Sledge comes in for 6 with 4 resources, whereas Winter's Wail, when you pitch 3 into it and that 3 is an ice card, you get 5 resources worth of value. You're coming in with for 4 damage with a frostbite on top of it, which let's just say for sake of argument that's, 1 extra point of value. So if Wail swings for 5 at 3 resources and Sledge swings for 6 at 4 resources, you're basically getting the same rate on both cards, but Winter's Wail is a one-handed weapon, which means the Oldhim is allowed to also bring in a shield, whether Rampart or Stalagmite, both obviously amazing offhand items in their own rights, but the fact that you get that on top of a rate that's equivalent to a two-handed weapon is what made this card quite ridiculous, and I really like that that is the explanation they have for banning this card, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, as for how much this will affect Oldhim's presence in the current metagame, let's talk about how integral Winter's Wail was to what they were trying to do. And for this argument, I'm going to be talking about the more aggressive Oldhims, the ones that have come about to combat Icelanders and dashes, not the extreme fatigue type of Oldhims that are running triple remembrance. I know that's been going around and is somewhat popular, but I'm going to be talking about the more aggressive Oldhims right now. And in those game plans, Oldhims were winning the aggressive matchups, like against Runeblades and against Faiz, by just sending big attacks with disruption behind them. We're talking Spinal Crushes, we're talking Terra Sunders, we're talking CNC Pummels, etc. So with that game plan, I don't think Winter's Wail, the banning of Winter's Wail has affected that game plan all too much. Where it does get affected is Oldhim's off turns. So plenty of times Oldhim draws into 4 blues and then they block out with 3 of them, or maybe include an Ice React and just send back a Winter's Wail on their turn. Now that part is obviously affected, and that is some equity that the aggro decks get from there. But the rest of what Oldhim is doing in those matchups and into Iyslander is still extremely, extremely strong. And so I fully expect Oldhim to still be a mainstay in the metagame to come. And yeah, they might just change their weapon to be Titan's Fist instead of Winter's Wail, or we might see something else as well. But in any case, I think Oldhim is still going to be one of the top decks to face in the coming meta. Next, we have 2 cards that have been suspended until Iyslander hits Living Legend, and those are Hypothermia and Amulet of Ice. So let's start with Hypothermia. And for Hypothermia, the justification they gave for banning this card is that it is a single free, as in 0-cost blue card that routinely steals turns from heroes such as Briar, Dash, and Fi. And unfortunately, I do begrudgingly agree with this. Now, as an Iyslander player myself, I do have to admit that Hypothermia definitely just felt pretty unfair, particularly when I'm against either Runeblade or Katsu or Dorinthia. Now, I think Dash is probably a bit of a weaker example because Dash with natural AB3 and everything blocking 3 can play around it somewhat by blocking out on the Icelander's turn and then playing maybe a boost card such that the Hypothermia only ever gets maybe 1 card's worth of value from the dash. However, heroes like Katsu, Dorinthia, and both Runeblades didn't quite have this option. They don't have that level of defensive capability. So what often happens is that they will go to their turn with 4 cards and Hypothermia blows them out by stealing 3 cards from them effectively. And that definitely felt pretty unfair and in some ways reminded me of what Prism did to Wizard players and Guardians when she was around. They could just play this one board state piece that the opposing hero couldn't interact with because the deck just wasn't built for it, and effectively gate kept those decks out of the format. It does feel like Iyslander with 3 copies of Hypothermia in her list gatekeeps to some extent the Runeblades and Katsus and Dorinthias from the meta. So I begrudgingly have to admit that I think Hypothermia did have to go and opens up the meta for these heroes to come back in and hopefully give us a more diverse and even more diverse meta, if that's possible, for the upcoming metagame. Next, we have Amulet of Ice. And for this one, the justification given was that Amulet of Ice is a key card for Iyslander in both aggro matchups and control matchups, as well as a card that has very little deck building cost and very little play cost in the sense that it costs 0 and has go again, which means Iyslander gets to perform more actions after setting up this board state piece. Now for this one, I do think it is a bit of an overkill of a nerf against Iyslander. I think that saying that Iyslander needs to rely on something like an Insidious Chill to spike disruption is a bit too much of an ask, because a lot of times against aggro, or even against Oldhims that are being aggressive into you, trying to resolve an Insidious Chill is a huge tempo loss that you can very much get punished for, because not only do you need to seed tempo to play the Insidious Chill, you need to get 3 more activations out of it at some point before, you actually got full value out of the chill. And so a lot of times that is just not possible. If you see the chill a little too late, where life totals are maybe about halfway through and the game's going really quick, there's no point resolving the Insidious Chill. It's too much of a tempo loss for not enough gain. So Amulet of Ice was a very key thing that Iyslander needed to spike her disruption on those in those matchups where she can't resolve Insidious Chill, and all those turns where she really needs to spike disruption. So, for example, when there's a Chalmant Heroic on the field, or the fight just resolved in Art of War, you play your blue card, fuse it, and you get to pop your Amulet of Ice. I think without Amulet of Ice, a key part of Iyslander's identity is also affected, because now it is very difficult for her to take more than one card from her aggro opponent. So Ice Vein, of course, still exists, but without Amulet of Ice, and of course in a situation where Insidious Chill was too difficult to resolve, because as what we talked about earlier, your aggro opponent can just take all the damage from the Ice Vein and just lose one card. And so it feels like Iyslander doesn't really quite have the tools to take more than one card from aggro now, and to me that really affects her identity as well as her viability into those decks, and also into aggressive Oldhims. So with all that being said, where do I see Iyslander in the current metagame? I think Iyslander is in a bit of a rough spot after these changes. Now, of course, I haven't played with it, and maybe, Winter's Bite coming in as a potential replacement for Amulet of Ice is good enough and still keeps her dominant against aggro decks. But my initial impression is that I think she's going to struggle a little, particularly because of the Runeblade matchup. Now, the Runeblade matchup, which I think Iyslander players are familiar with, is that if the Briar opponent gets one good Chalmant Heroic turn where you did not manage to find a disruption, the game can just be lost right there. Similarly with Viscerai, if they get one good Mordred Tide Revel turn and you didn't have the correct disruption you needed, you might just lose the game there. And now without Hypothermia, and without Amulet of Ice allowing you to spike a disruption on key turns, those windows that Runeblades have now to find that key one big turn to push you out of the game, that window just got a lot wider. So I do think that the Runeblade matchup might now be close to a 50-50. Maybe it is slightly favored for Iyslander, once we bring Winter's Bites in. But I think overall it is a lot closer to 50-50. And our bad matchups, like Dash and Dromai, went from unfavored / slightly unfavored to really, really bad. So I struggle to see what justification there is to bring Iyslander to a tournament now. I think the only matchup where you are, I think, guaranteed to be favored is Fi, because they lost Belittle. Whereas the other aggro decks like Runeblades never ran Belittle anyway, so it's really just nerfs on your end because of the loss of Hypothermia and Amulet of Ice. Now, this may not necessarily be a bad thing. She has been a key part of the metagame for quite a while now, and maybe it's her time to be benched a little. But I do think that until we see more support for her, we might see Iyslander just stay in the tier 2 level for a little while. Finally, we have Belittle, and for this one, the justification given that as a generic, it was just way too easy for aggro decks to, put Belittle and Minimism in their deck and start cheating the resource curve of the game, which I think makes a lot of sense. I think it makes me a little sad because I don't get to play my really jank Belittle Briar list, but I think I definitely do agree with them that for the long-term health of the game, having these pair of cards that very blatantly cheat the resource curve of the game would definitely cause problems down the line, and arguably have already caused and are causing problems right now. The fact that Belittle, when you fetch a red Minimism, was just a 1 for 6, which sometimes upside in Runeblade with, being able to creep as it out, and their natural synergy with playing non-attacks. Or, when you fetch a blue Minnowism, it's a 3 damage thing that came in and refunded you 2 resources, kind of like a yellow gem that says when you pitch it, deal 3 to your opponent. Both those cases were just very, very strong, especially as generic cards. So I'm definitely glad that I'm glad to see them go, and I do think that it was necessary for the health of the game. As for where Fi will be after the loss of Belittle, I still think Fi has a very strong place in this metagame. I think Belittle Minnowism allowed Fi to have even spikier turns with Out of War and Mask of the Pouncing Lynx, but even without it, Out of War and Mask of the Pouncing Lynx on their own do give Fi a very, very good spiky turn, and the rest of the kit just lends itself to being a little more consistent than the other aggro decks like the Runeblades, because, Fi never has a problem of drawing all 4 non-attacks. So the loss of Belittle Minnowism makes it slightly less consistent, but I think it is still on par, if not better, than the other aggro decks anyway, especially since Mask of the Pouncing Lynx is just a very, very strong card that they still have access to. So I do expect to still see Fi in the metagame. Of course, the loss of Belittle hurts their matchup into Iyslander specifically, but of course, whether that affects Fi's presence in the metagame depends on Iyslander presence in the metagame, and if we do see Iyslander's presence going down because of the loss of Hypothermia and Amulets of Ice, I don't expect this loss of Belittle to affect Fi that much. So those were the bans and suspensions in today's bans and suspensions announcement. Let me know in the comments what you think about these. Whether you think these are healthy for the game or whether they're unhealthy for the game. And let me know if you agree or / violently disagree with anything that I said. Thank you so much for watching and hope you enjoyed it.